My name is Rosa Moretti. I'm 68 years old. I've run this diner on Fulton Street for 31 years alone, since my husband Carlo died in 2009. Dante Sterling is a real estate developer. He wants this block. He wants to tear down everything on it and put up a 47-floor tower with his name on the lobby wall. 6 months ago, his office started sending letters. Buyout offers, each one larger than the last. I sent 7 refusals back. My hands shook writing every one because Carlo built this counter himself. And his father carried that jukebox up these front steps in 1957, and there are things that don't have a price. Dante Sterling didn't like that answer. First came the brick through my front window at midnight. Then his lawyers stood in front of my neighbors at the zoning hearing and called me a senile risk to public health. A 68-year-old widow who couldn't manage her own property. They filed foreclosure papers on a $15,000 tax debt to force my hand. When none of that moved me, he decided to come himself. Dante Sterling is a man who has never once in his life accepted the word no. What he wanted, he took. What he couldn't take, he destroyed. To him, this diner was an obstacle. And I was just an old woman who hadn't yet understood that she'd already lost. He walked in with a sledgehammer. The jukebox went first, Carlo's father's jukebox, the one that has stood in that corner since before I was born. Chrome across the tile, records in pieces. Then he turned to face the marble counter, and I understood what he was telling me: nothing here is safe, and nothing here is yours anymore. You should have taken the money, Rosa. I didn't move. I watched his hands raise the hammer. The Carrara split. Dust on my lips. 3 pieces on my floor. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. 1 year ago, I sat alone in a hospital room and signed a single line at the bottom of the consent form. Anonymous. Do not contact my family. Do not tell the recipient. Dante Sterling's 12-year-old son was in surgery down that hall. He has no idea what this diner already gave him. The city never fully slept, but it came close that particular hour just before 4 in the morning when even the sirens seemed to hold their breath. From the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, Brooklyn spread out below like a circuit board, every block a wire, every building a node humming with someone else's unfinished life. Dante Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling window in his bathrobe. A glass of bourbon untouched on the granite ledge beside him, and looked at the borough the way a general surveys a field before the first shot is fired. The report was on the coffee table behind him. He didn't need to look at it again. He had the numbers memorized the way other men memorized their wedding anniversaries or their children's birthdays with a reverence that bordered on the religious. $41,700,000. That was the current liquidated value of the company's employee retirement fund. The one he had restructured 3 years ago to give himself broader discretionary access. His CFO had called it aggressive portfolio rebalancing. Dante had called it preparation. The board had called it visionary. Nobody had called it what it actually was, because the numbers told a story that was easier to read as ambition than as anything else. The Apex Tower project needed that capital. 47 floors of mixed-use luxury development, a steel and glass monument to the name Sterling. That would anchor the southern edge of Brooklyn for the next 100 years. He had already seen the renderings so many times that he sometimes confused them with memories: the lobby with its imported Italian marble, the rooftop terrace with its infinity edge, the ground floor retail spaces that would generate enough passive income to fund Leo's future 3 times over. Every brick was accounted for. Every square foot was already sold in his mind. The only thing standing between Dante Sterling and that future was a narrow parcel of land on Fulton Street. He finally turned away from the window and walked to the table. He opened the folder not to read it but to look at the aerial photograph. Clipped to the inside cover, a satellite image of the block, with the target parcel outlined in red marker. The building in the center of that red outline was a low, 2-story structure with a hand-painted sign across the awning. Moretti's Diner, Est, 1961. The letters were faded at the edges. In the photograph, taken in late October, there were strings of orange and yellow lights in the window, and a small cardboard pumpkin taped to the glass door. Dante closed the folder. 3 miles south and 42 floors down, Rosa Moretti was already awake. She had been awake since 2:30, which was not unusual. Sleep had become a negotiation in recent years, something she bartered with her body in exchange for getting through the following day without incident. She sat at the end of the prep counter in the diner's kitchen, still in her housecoat. A mug of black coffee cooling beside her right hand and 2 pieces of paper spread flat under the fluorescent light above the industrial sink. The first was a Medicare Part D notice, folded and unfolded so many times that the crease lines had gone soft. The document informed her, in the measured language of federal bureaucracy, that her current prescription coverage would no longer include one of the medications she had been taking since her surgery the previous year. The alternative plan they recommended would cost her $62 more per month. Rosa had circled the number in blue pen and written a question mark beside it, as though she were still waiting for the figure to explain itself. The second document was a property tax arrears notice from the city of New York. $15,000. The number sat on the page with a weight that had nothing to do with font size. Rosa picked up her coffee, found it cold, and set it back down. She had run this diner for 31 years. First with her husband Carlo and then, after his heart gave out in the walk-in cooler on a Tuesday morning in 2009, alone. She had never missed a payroll. She had fed people during 2 blizzards, a blackout, and the long, strange months of the pandemic when she packed hot soup into paper bags and left them on the sidewalk for whoever needed them. The diner was not a business to Rosa, or not only that. It was the shape her life had taken, the container that held everything she had loved and lost and kept going for. She folded both documents carefully and tucked them into the drawer beneath the cash register, the same drawer where she kept her rosary beads and the photograph of Carlo from their honeymoon in 1978. Then she put on her apron and began the prep work for the morning rush, slicing onions with the focused economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times and knew that the crying was just chemistry. He came in at 11:10. The diner was at its mid-morning lull, the breakfast crowd gone, the lunch crowd not yet arrived. 2 regulars occupied the corner booth, and Millie, Rosa's only waitstaff on weekdays now, was wiping down the pie case with a damp cloth. The bell above the door announced the arrival, and Rosa looked up from the grill. She registered the suit first. Italian cut, charcoal with a faint chalk stripe, the kind of garment that cost more than her monthly revenue. The man wearing it was lean and precise in his movements, with the slightly hollow cheeks of someone who ate for fuel and treated every meal as a logistical exercise. He looked around the diner with the careful, assessing eyes of an inspector taking in the cracked vinyl of the stools, the water stain on the ceiling tile above the dessert case, the 1950s jukebox in the corner with its chrome trim and its hand-lettered song cards. He sat at the counter. Rosa set a mug in front of him and poured coffee without being asked. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'm Dante Sterling. I think you know why I'm here." Rosa picked up a cloth and wiped the section of counter to her left. She wiped slowly and thoroughly, the way she always did. "I know who you are," she said. "Coffee's on the house. The rest isn't." Dante reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, sliding it across the counter toward her. Rosa didn't touch it. He opened it himself and turned it so that the number on the document inside faced her. It was a significant number. It would have been significant to most people. Rosa looked at it for a moment, then looked back at the coffee pot in her hand. "This grease trap is worth nothing compared to my vision, Rosa." His voice was even, not unkind, calibrated to the specific frequency of a man who was accustomed to delivering finality dressed as generosity. "I'm offering you a graceful exit, not a fight." Rosa set the coffee pot back on the burner. She was quiet for a moment. The jukebox in the corner clicked and whirred softly, the internal mechanism cycling through some process of its own. "My husband proposed to me at that counter," she said finally, nodding toward the curved marble section near the window. "You want some pie? I made apple this morning." Dante looked at her for a moment. He pushed the envelope slightly closer to her side of the counter. Then he put his hands flat on the surface and stood. It was as he turned to leave that he saw it just for a moment, a flash of orange prescription plastic as Rosa reached across to take a customer's empty mug. She moved quickly, but not quickly enough. The amber bottle caught the light before she tucked it into the wide front pocket of her apron. He caught one word on the label before it disappeared: tacrolimus. An immunosuppressant, the kind prescribed after organ transplant surgery. Dante Sterling stood very still for just a fraction of a second. Then he straightened his jacket and walked out of the diner. The door swung shut behind him with its familiar bell, and the smell of old coffee and bacon grease and decades of morning light settled back into the room. Somewhere in the booth by the window, one of the regulars laughed at something the other had said. Rosa refilled their mugs without being asked. Outside, on the sidewalk, Dante stood beside his car and looked at the diner's lit window. The faint, particular smell of the place had followed him, worked its way into the fibers of his suit in that short time, the way certain smells do. Grease and coffee and something older underneath, something that had no name but felt uncomfortably like permanence. He got in the car and told the driver to go. The Sterling Apex headquarters occupied 3 floors of a glass building in Midtown Manhattan, and on a good day, the view from Dante's corner office made him feel like the city was something he had personally assembled. This was not a good day. He stood at the whiteboard in the conference room, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and stared at the project timeline as though the problem were a matter of scheduling, rather than of a 68-year-old woman who had looked at a buyout offer and asked if he wanted apple pie. She didn't say no, his project director asked from across the table. She didn't say anything. Dante uncapped a marker and drew a bracket around the Fulton Street parcel on the site map. Which is the same as no? Which is worse than no? The room was quiet. 3 senior staff members sat around the table, with the practiced stillness of people who had learned that silence in Dante's vicinity was safer than any alternative. The project timeline on the wall showed the Apex Tower groundbreaking scheduled for the following spring. The financing was contingent on the full parcel. The bank had made that clear in language that left no interpretive room. After the meeting, Dante called Marcus Sloan into his office and closed the door. Marcus was a large man with a careful way of moving that suggested he had once been required to move carefully, in situations where the consequences of error were more serious than a missed quarterly target. He had spent 14 years with the NYPD and the last 8 working exclusively for Dante, handling the category of problem that did not appear on any official project document. Find a weakness, Dante said. He was looking out the window. The woman has medical expenses. Find out how bad. Marcus nodded once. He wrote nothing down. He never did. And be quiet about it, Dante added. I don't want a brick through a window. I want information. The hospital bills, as it turned out, were considerable. Marcus brought the file to Dante's office 3 days later, not the originals, which he had obtained through a contact at a collections firm, but photographs of the relevant documents, printed in paper clipped in chronological order. Rosa Moretti had undergone a major surgical procedure 11 months ago. The procedure itself, the follow-up care, the medications, the physical therapy, the ongoing immunosuppressant protocol, the stack of unpaid and partially paid invoices represented a sum that was not quite catastrophic, but was certainly unsustainable against the income of a single-location diner with aging infrastructure and a declining lunch trade. Dante read through the file at his desk that evening. His office was lit only by the desk lamp, the rest of the room dark, the city glittering beyond the glass. He read with the methodical attention he gave to all financial documents, noting figures, cross-referencing dates, looking for the structural weakness in another person's situation the way an engineer looks for the load-bearing failure point in a building he intends to demolish. He was on the 3rd page when his phone buzzed. An email from Leo's pediatric specialist at Mount Sinai, with the subject line monthly update post-transplant monitoring. Dante set the file down. He opened the email and read it slowly, the way he always read these, with a particular quality of attention that had no equivalent anywhere else in his life, not even in his financial documents. Leo's latest bloodwork showed stable graft function. His tacrolimus levels were in the therapeutic range. He had gained 4 pounds since the previous check-in. His soccer coach had noted an improvement in his stamina. Dante exhaled. Leo was 12 years old and had spent his 11th year in and out of hospitals, with a condition that had been, for 6 terrible months, a countdown rather than a diagnosis. The night the transplant coordinator had called to say a viable donor segment had been found, Dante had been in a parking garage, unable to drive, sitting on the floor between two cars with his phone pressed against his chest. Crying in a way he had not cried since his own father's funeral. He had not told anyone about that. He had reconstructed himself by the time he reached the hospital, walked in with his jaw set and his bearing composed, and stood at his son's bedside through the night with the controlled watchfulness of a man who had learned that falling apart was a luxury he could not afford. He stood up now and walked down the hall to Leo's room. The boy was asleep on his back, one arm flung over the side of the bed, his mouth slightly open. He had Dante's sharp nose and his mother's wide forehead, and in sleep he looked utterly unguarded. A 12-year-old kid with a soccer poster on the wall and a half-eaten granola bar on the nightstand, and no idea how close the distance between his life and the absence of it had once been. Dante stood in the doorway for a long moment. "I'm doing this for you, Leo." His voice was barely above a murmur, calibrated to the specific frequency of a man speaking to himself through his sleeping child. "Every brick I lay is for you." He pulled the door softly closed and stood in the hallway, and the question that had been sitting in the back of his chest since he'd opened Marcus's file pressed forward with an insistence he could not fully account for. Is it ever enough? He didn't answer it. He went back to his office, opened the Rosa Moretti file, and began drafting instructions for the next phase. Rosa discovered the brick at 20 past midnight. She had stayed late to finish the quarterly books, a task she performed by hand in a ledger Carlo had started in 1993. The columns in her handwriting now filling pages that had once been his. She had been in the back office when she heard it, not a crash exactly, more of a concussive thud followed by the musical disintegration of glass. Bright and brief in the quiet of the late hour. She came out of the kitchen to find the front window had a hole the size of a cantaloupe near the lower right corner. A constellation of cracks spreading outward from the impact point, and a section of sidewalk visible through the gap. A chunk of brick sat on the linoleum floor surrounded by glass. The cold November air moved through the hole and swirled the paper napkins in the dispenser near the window. Rosa looked at the brick for a long time. She got the broom from the closet. She swept the glass carefully and thoroughly, working from the outside in, collecting the pieces into the dustpan. With the focused patience of a woman who understood that some messes did not announce their causes and did not wait for explanations before they needed to be cleaned up. She taped a piece of cardboard over the hole, using the good packing tape from the supply shelf. She checked the rest of the windows. She turned off the lights, locked the front door, and went upstairs to the apartment above the diner where she had lived since 1991. She did not call the police. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and held her rosary, and the particular quality of her silence was not fear. It was something older and more complicated than fear, the kind of quiet that belongs to a person who has already made their most important decisions, and is now simply waiting to see how the world chooses to respond. Outside, Brooklyn carried on its own conversation with itself, the sound of it rising through the old walls of the building: a taxi, a dog, someone's music from an open window. 3 floors up, the texture of ordinary life continuing in all directions, indifferent and sustaining at once. Rosa set her rosary on the nightstand and lay down. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The zoning hearing was held on the second Thursday of November in a municipal conference room on the 4th floor of the Brooklyn Borough Hall. Annex, a room with fluorescent lighting and chairs that had been uncomfortable for 30 years and showed no signs of improving. The gallery was about half full when Rosa arrived. She recognized most of the faces: Gus Papadimitriou from the hardware store 2 blocks over, the Okafor family, who ran the laundromat on the corner, Father Tim from St. Anthony's, a handful of people she had been serving breakfast to for 20 years. They had come because she had mentioned the hearing, and because in a neighborhood under pressure, people showed up for each other when they could still afford to. Dante's legal team occupied the table on the right side of the room. There were 4 of them, all young, all in suits that cost more than anyone in the gallery made in a month. And they had arranged their documents and laptops with the efficient precision of people who did this professionally and regarded the outcome as predetermined. The proceedings opened with the standard procedural language. The project was described as a mixed-use development of significant community benefit. The legal team presented their materials with the smooth, unhurried confidence of people who had already had the relevant conversations in the relevant offices before this room was convened. Then they addressed the parcel question. Rosa watched the youngest of the four attorneys stand and begin speaking. He was perhaps 30, with good posture and a practiced lack of affect, and he described her diner in the language of municipal liability with the same tone he might have used to describe a storm drain. He cited the building's age, its maintenance records, a health department inspection from 2 years ago that had noted an issue with the kitchen ventilation that Rosa had since corrected, and a structural assessment commissioned by Sterling Apex that characterized the building as a potential public safety concern. He used the phrase deteriorating infrastructure 4 times. He used the phrase risk to community health 3 times. He did not once look at Rosa. At one point he said, without any particular emphasis, that the current operator appeared to be managing the property beyond her physical and financial capacity, and that the community would be better served by the development's inclusion of affordable ground floor retail that could accommodate a replacement food service establishment. From the gallery, someone said, "Shame on you." Dante's attorney continued without pausing. When Rosa was finally given time to speak, she stood at the podium and looked at the board members and then at the gallery. And she said what she had prepared to say simply and without theatrics: the history of the building, the number of families she had employed over 30 years. The fact that the structural assessment had been conducted by a firm retained by the buyer without independent verification. Father Tim began to clap halfway through. Others joined him. The board chairman thanked her for her statement and indicated that the hearing would continue. Rosa sat back down. Her hands in her lap were perfectly still. He came to the diner the following morning. Rosa was alone in the kitchen, the prep work done, the doors not yet open, when she heard the front lock rattle and then give. She came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a towel to find Dante Sterling standing inside the door, and behind him, held in his right hand with the casual ease of someone carrying a tennis racket, a sledgehammer. For a moment neither of them spoke. Rosa looked at the sledgehammer. She looked at Dante's face. His expression was not angry. That was the thing she registered first, and it was more disturbing than anger would have been. He looked like a man who had performed a calculation and arrived at a conclusion and was now simply executing the result. He crossed the room to the corner where the jukebox stood. The Wurlitzer had been in the diner since 1957. Carlo's father had bought it secondhand from a tavern in Red Hook. And it had worked imperfectly, intermittently, but continuously for 67 years. It played 45 revolutions per minute records that could no longer be replaced, and the mechanism stuck on humid days. And the chrome trim on the left side had a dent from the time a drunk customer in 1984 had tried to use it as a support while falling. Rosa had never had it repaired because the dent was, in some way she had never fully articulated, part of the thing. Dante swung the sledgehammer. The first blow destroyed the top panel. The chrome shattered and the wood splintered and the interior mechanism made a sound like a brief, compressed scream before going silent. The second blow caved in the front face. The glass cracked and fell inward, and the record carousel tipped sideways and the records, those unreplaceable records, slid and fractured against each other with a sound like ice breaking on a winter river. He stepped over the debris and walked to the curved marble counter near the window. The counter was original to the 1961 build Carrara marble with a gray-green vein running through it, worn to a soft polish by 30 years of elbows and coffee mugs. Carlo had sanded and refinished the wood base twice. Rosa had had the staining resealed after the pipe burst in 2018. Dante raised the sledgehammer. The marble shattered across the floor in 3 large pieces and a spray of fragments that skittered to the baseboards and the legs of the stools. He set the sledgehammer down, standing it upright with one hand, and turned to look at Rosa. She had not moved. She had not said a word. She stood in the gap between the counter and the kitchen doorway with the dish towel still in her hands. And she watched the dust from the marble settle in the morning light coming through the windows, and her expression was something. Not what he had expected. Not what he had prepared for. She should have screamed. She should have threatened, or wept, or at minimum flinched. Instead she looked at the dust, and at him, and her eyes held something that was not fear and not fury but something quieter and more patient than either. "You think you're building a tower, Dante," she said finally. Her voice was even. "But you're just digging a grave." Dante held her gaze for a moment. He picked up the sledgehammer. He turned toward the door. It was at the threshold that he stopped. Something small and rectangular lay on the floor near the baseboard, dislodged from somewhere by the vibration of the impact's a card. A standard hospital issue appointment card, the kind printed on heavy white stock with the institution's logo in the upper left corner. It must have fallen from behind the counter, slipped from some accumulation of papers, or a space between the register and the wall where such things collect over the years. Dante bent and picked it up. Mount Sinai Hospital, Hepatology and Transplant Services. The appointment date was printed on the card. His eyes moved to the date, and the date stopped him the way a physical barrier stops a moving body. It was the same day Leo had had his surgery. He stood in the doorway for another moment, the card in his hand, looking at it. Behind him, he could hear Rosa begin to move small sounds, unhurried, the scrape of a dustpan being retrieved from the closet. The sound of a woman who had been cleaning up other people's messes for 68 years and intended to continue doing so. Dante stepped out onto the sidewalk. The card was still in his hand. He stood there for a moment in the November air, looking at it. And then he put it in his jacket pocket and walked to his car and sat in the back seat and said nothing to the driver for a very long time. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Wednesday. Rosa stood at the kitchen prep counter and read it twice, then a third time, not because the language was unclear, but because the mind sometimes requires a second and third pass at a document before it will accept the thing the document is saying. Sterling Apex had moved through a subsidiary LLC to acquire the tax arrears note from the city at a discount, a legal maneuver not uncommon in commercial real estate, and was now pursuing foreclosure proceedings on the basis of that outstanding debt. $15,000. After 31 years, she folded the notice and placed it in the drawer with the Medicare paperwork and the photograph of Carlo and her rosary beads. And then she stood at the counter for a while with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance. The way a person stands when they are absorbing something that has a weight beyond its paperwork. She did not cry. She had cried after Carlo died, and after the surgery, and once in the parking lot of the hospital. When a nurse had said the words donor complication with a particular quality of uncertainty in her voice that had since resolved into reassurance. She had a finite understanding of what crying was for and when it served any purpose, and she was past the point of either. She put on her apron and opened the diner. In his office on the 42nd floor, Dante held the foreclosure notice and felt none of the satisfaction he had anticipated. He had anticipated satisfaction. He had, if he were being precise about it, been moving toward this moment for 4 months. With the focused momentum of a man who had trained himself to equate acquisition with progress and progress with meaning. The diner was the last obstacle. The foreclosure proceeding was the final instrument. He had his attorneys, his timelines, his renderings, his investors. He had everything he needed to break ground in the spring and complete the tower that would exist as the most tangible proof of his life's work. He set the document on his desk and looked at it. The hollow feeling it produced was not new. He had encountered it before on the day the first Sterling commercial property lease was signed. On the day the company crossed the $100 million revenue threshold, on the day of his divorce. When the papers were filed and the apartment on the Upper East Side became his alone and the absence of Leo in it on school nights produced a silence that no amount of work could adequately fill. He recognized the feeling the way a person recognizes a recurring dream, familiar, slightly dreadful, imperfectly understood. He opened his email, the daily project update from Marcus. Then, out of habit or some impulse he didn't examine, he opened the subfolder where he kept Leo's medical communications. He read the most recent one again. Stable graft function. Therapeutic tacrolimus levels. 4 pounds gained. Stamina improved. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out the folder Marcus had delivered 3 days ago. The one he hadn't been able to stop thinking about. It had taken Marcus 2 weeks to obtain it, and the obtaining had not been clean. A contact inside the hospital's administrative system, a man who had done Marcus favors before and understood the terms of such arrangements, had pulled the original transplant donor record and photographed the relevant pages. Marcus had printed them on his personal printer and driven them to Dante's apartment on a Sunday morning in a plain manila envelope and said nothing beyond the delivery. He had understood, as he always understood, that this was a category of task that did not benefit from discussion. Dante had not opened the envelope for 3 days after Marcus brought it. He opened the folder now. The donor was listed as a living partial donor. A voluntary, non-directed donation of 60% of a healthy liver segment from a donor who had consented to anonymity. The medical profile was their blood type, compatibility markers, surgical notes from the procedure. Everything correct, everything matched to Leo's surgical record. With the mechanical precision of a transplant that had, against the statistical odds of living donation, gone extremely well. He turned to the next page. The donor photograph was a standard hospital identification image taken for file purposes. Not artistic ones, under fluorescent light, with the particular flatness of institutional photography. The woman in the photograph was younger than she was now. Her hair was shorter. She was wearing a hospital gown, and the expression on her face was specific, not a smile. Exactly, but the kind of composure that belongs to a person who has made a large decision and is at peace with it. He knew her face. He had been looking at it for 4 months across a diner counter. Rosa Moretti. Dante set the photograph down. He sat in his leather chair behind the desk and his hands were completely still on the surface of the folder, and the realization moved through him not like a shock, not the sudden violent kind. Not the electricity of surprise, but like a tide coming in across a flat shore, slow and total and covering everything. It reached the foreclosure notice on the desk beside the folder, and the construction renderings pinned to the wall above his credenza, and the aerial photograph of the Fulton Street parcel. With its red outline, and Leo's medical file in the subfolder on his screen, and the sledgehammer in his memory, the sound of the jukebox coming apart, the marble fracturing across the floor. Rosa Moretti had been cut open in a hospital on the same day Dante's son had been cut open in a hospital on another floor of the same building. She had given 60% of her liver to an anonymous 12-year-old boy who would not make the weekend. And Dante had spent the subsequent 11 months dismantling everything she had. My hands are stained with more than just dirt. The thought arrived fully formed, without warning, in a voice that sounded like his own, but came from a part of himself he had not consulted in a very long time. He sat with it. He did not try to counter it or reframe it or convert it into something actionable, which was his usual response to discomfort. He simply sat with it in his darkened office, the city, brilliant and indifferent beyond the glass, and felt the full, suffocating weight of what he had done to the person who had given his son a second life. He did not call anyone. He did not draft an email or open a spreadsheet or reach for the bourbon on the ledge. He sat in the chair until the city outside began its slow, reluctant concession to the hours before dawn. And the glow on the horizon shifted, degree by degree, from black to the particular dark blue that precedes everything else. And he understood with a clarity that owed nothing to calculation that there was no financial instrument in existence capable of addressing what he had just learned about himself. Friends, we've just walked through 4 of the most difficult chapters of this story, and I have to say I'm still feeling the weight of it. We watched Dante Sterling, a man who had everything, use every tool at his disposal to dismantle. A woman who had already given more than most of us will ever be asked to give. Rosa held her ground through the buyout offer, through the brick in the window, through the public humiliation at that zoning hearing, through the sound of her husband's jukebox being destroyed in front of her eyes. She stood in that dust and said, "You're just digging a grave," and she was right in ways she couldn't have known and he couldn't have understood. Not yet. And now Dante knows. He's sitting in that chair with Rosa's photograph in his hands. And the whole architecture of his ambition has just collapsed into something he can't build his way out of. The question is, what does a man like that do with the truth when it finally arrives? Stay with us. The second half of this story is where everything changes for both of them. The clinical room on the 6th floor of Mount Sinai's transplant center smelled the way all such rooms smell: antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that had no clinical name but that the body recognizes and responds to without being asked. Rosa sat in the chair beside the examination table, not on it, because she had arrived early and preferred to wait. sitting upright in a regular chair like a person rather than perched on paper-covered vinyl like a patient. She was wearing her coat over her clothes and her purse was on her lap and she held her rosary in both hands. The way she held it when she was thinking rather than praying, turning the beads through her fingers, one at a time, with the unhurried rhythm of someone working a problem that doesn't have a solution so much as an acceptance. It was 11 months ago. November of the previous year, the week after Thanksgiving. She had been at this hospital twice before for consultations, filling out forms, submitting to blood draws and compatibility assessments, and conversations with the transplant coordinator that had a quality of careful, managed delicacy. As though the medical team understood that a person making this particular decision was not doing so for reasons that responded well to being questioned too directly. They had given her information. They had confirmed her eligibility. They had explained, in language both precise and kind, what the surgical and recovery process would involve. She had listened to all of it. She had asked a few questions. She had not wavered. Through the thin wall of the room she could hear voices in the corridor. Nurses, the low register of a doctor on his rounds, the particular hushed urgency of hospital communication. And then, clearly, two voices passing close to her door. The boys' numbers dropped again this morning. Is the family here? They haven't left. The father's been in the waiting room since Tuesday. The kid won't make the weekend if. The voices moved on down the corridor. Rosa sat very still. She was 67 years old and she had already had her conversation with mortality, the quiet kind, in the privacy of her own kitchen in the early hours. The kind where you do the math of what remains and what matters and what you are able to do about either. She had survived Carlo's death and a business that tried twice to fail and a surgery she had not told anyone about because telling people created obligations she didn't want to impose. She had made her peace with her own fragility. That wasn't the hard part. The hard part was hearing he won't make the weekend and feeling it in the exact place where she still had enough to give. She turned the rosary beads through her fingers. She gripped her Medicare card in her other hand. The physical card, the one she carried in the left compartment of her purse, worn at the edges from years of wallet friction. It was, in practical terms, an instrument of limitation. What it covered, what it didn't cover, what the supplemental plan added and what it still left behind. She knew its contents the way she knew the diner's books precisely, without illusion. None of that changed what she was going to do. I don't need to know his name. The thought arrived with a simplicity that she recognized as clarity. The particular quality of certainty that follows a decision that has already been made somewhere deeper than the reasoning mind and is now simply waiting to be acknowledged. She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of Carlo, and of the morning light on the diner counter, and of the particular way the Brooklyn sky looked in early winter when the clouds were high and pale and everything below them was still impossible. If he lives, the world stays a little brighter. She opened her eyes and put the rosary in her purse. And stood and straightened her coat and was ready when the transplant coordinator knocked and opened the door. Present day. Dante sat at his desk with Rosa's photograph and understood. With the kind of understanding that arrives after everything else has been exhausted, that Rosa had been preparing her informed consent documents on the same morning he had been reviewing the first Sterling Apex acquisition proposal for the Fulton Street parcel. She had been deciding to give her body while he had been deciding to take her building. The first eviction notice from his legal team had been filed 6 weeks after her surgery, during the period when her recovery would have been at its most demanding. The early weeks of a major hepatological procedure, the strict medication compliance, the limited mobility. The slow return of energy that living donors describe as the longest part of the recovery. She had been managing all of that, alone, upstairs from the diner, and he had been filing papers. He closed the folder. He held very still for a long moment, and then he picked up his phone and called Marcus Sloan. Stop everything, he said. All of it, every proceeding, every motion, every pressure point. Stop it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, that's going to have implications for. I know what it's going to have implications for, Dante said. Stop it. He ended the call and sat alone in his office as the city outside his window began its long daily argument with itself. And the first uncertain intimation of what he would need to do next began to take shape in the way that difficult things do, not as a plan exactly, but as a direction. He fired Marcus on a Monday. It was a brief conversation, held in Dante's office with the door closed, the city gray and rain wet outside the floor-to-ceiling glass. Marcus sat across the desk with the contained steadiness of a man who had been expecting this and had decided, some time ago, how he would meet it. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He accepted the severance terms without reviewing the document, which was how Dante knew that Marcus understood precisely why this was happening and had his own accounting of it that didn't require discussion. The hospital file, Dante said, before Marcus stood to leave. How many people know about it? Just me, Marcus said. And now you, the contact who pulled it. He doesn't know what it was. He pulled a record number, photographed the pages, sent them through an intermediary. He doesn't know the name on the file. Dante nodded. He looked at his hands on the desk. I'm going to need to address that situation directly. The contact. I'll handle the retraction, Marcus said. It was the kind of sentence that, in Marcus's particular vocabulary, had a specific meaning. It meant the trail would be closed. He stood, picked up the severance envelope, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, Marcus said, and then stopped. Dante waited. Nothing, Marcus said. Never mind. He left. The diner was closed on Mondays. Dante knew this because he had had the diner's schedule obtained in the same file as everything else. And the detail had registered with the mechanical comprehensiveness of someone who collects information about obstacles. He stood on the sidewalk outside at 9 in the morning in a flannel shirt and trousers he had not worn in years. The kind of clothes he kept in the back of a closet because they were useful for things that didn't require a jacket, and looked at the dark window and the cardboard taped over the hole. Where the brick had come through, the edges of the tape beginning to peel in the autumn damp. He tried the door. It was locked. He stepped back and looked up at the second-floor windows. A light was on. He knocked on the door. He waited. He knocked again, 3 times, with the particular cadence of someone who is not leaving. There was a long silence. Then footsteps on the stairs inside, slow and deliberate, the footsteps of a person who has learned not to rush toward unexpected things. The light over the door came on. The deadbolt turned. Rosa opened the door 6 inches and looked at him through the gap. She was in a house dress and slippers, her gray hair loose around her face, and her expression, as she looked at him, was the expression of a woman taking the full measure of a situation before deciding how to respond to it. Dante held out his hands, empty. The gesture was so plainly and completely uncharacteristic of him that it seemed to register with her. I'm not here as a CEO, he said. I don't know what I'm here as. But I need to be inside. Rosa looked at him for another long moment. Then she opened the door. The diner in the morning, unlit and unoccupied, had a different quality than the diner in operation. The chairs were up on the tables. The light came in through the side windows at a low angle, laying long pale bars across the floor. The smell of the place was still there, old coffee and grease and something that was not quite wood. And not quite time, but partook of both, and it occupied the room with the assurance of something that had been present for 60 years and intended to remain. Dante stood in the middle of the floor and looked at what he had done. The debris from the jukebox had been swept but not removed. The pieces were collected in a cardboard box in the corner. The chrome panels and the broken wood and the fractured records layered with the careful organization of someone who had not yet decided whether any of it could be saved. The marble counter was gone. The wood base remained, scarred and exposed, the brackets where the marble had attached still holding fragments of the original slab along the edges. He went to the box. He knelt beside it and began to lift the pieces out, one at a time, setting them on the nearest table, sorting without knowing exactly what he was sorting for. The internal mechanism of the jukebox came out in several sections. He arranged them carefully. He picked up one of the broken records, unforgettable, Nat King Cole, the label still legible on the intact portion of the disc. He worked without speaking. Rosa brought 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen and set one on the table near where he was working and stood with hers and watched him for a while. I saw the file, he said. He kept his hands moving, kept sorting, because he could not do this while also being still. Rosa, I know about the liver. I know what you gave. And I know what that makes me. The room held the sentence. Rosa turned her coffee cup in both hands. She looked at the sorted pieces on the table, and at Dante's hands among them. The hands that had held the sledgehammer 2 weeks ago, that were now attempting, with an awkwardness that was almost painful to observe, to put something back together. "I can fix the counter," he said. His voice had the stripped quality of a man who has run out of the kind of language he's used to relying on. "I can pay the tax arrears. I know I can't. I know that none of this is." He stopped. Rosa was quiet. "I can't buy my way out of this," he said, and this was not a strategy or a negotiation. It was just the truth, stated plainly, by a man who had built his entire professional life on the premise that every problem had a financial solution. And was now confronted with the evidence of his own error. From the kitchen, the coffee maker produced its intermittent sounds. Outside, on Fulton Street, a delivery truck moved past with its hydraulic sigh. The normal sounds of a neighborhood making its way through a Monday. Rosa set down her coffee cup. She looked at him steadily. "Fix the counter first," she said. "Then we'll talk." He didn't leave until 4 in the afternoon. He spent the morning photographing every piece of the jukebox damage for a restoration specialist he'd located by phone, a man in New Jersey who repaired vintage Wurlitzers, and confirmed that, given the components Dante described, a full restoration was possible within 8 to 12 weeks. The records were another matter. The broken ones could not be replaced. But the specialist knew of a library of 45 revolutions per minute transfers and thought he could source 7 of the original 11 titles. In the afternoon, Dante drove to a marble supplier in Red Hook with photographs of the original counter surface. The Carrara marble of that vintage was not standard stock, but they had a warehouse batch of close match slabs acquired from a building demolition in Park Slope. He purchased 4 slabs, more than enough, and arranged for delivery. Then he sat in his car outside the supplier's warehouse and called his personal accountant. Rosa's hospital bills, the insurance EOBs, the explanation of benefits documents that itemized what her coverage had paid and what it had not. He had them from Marcus's file. He read the outstanding totals to his accountant and instructed that payment be made in full from his personal account. Not the company account, with no communication attached beyond the payment itself. His accountant asked if he wanted a receipt. "No," Dante said, "just make sure it's done today." He sat for a while longer. The rain had stopped and the late afternoon light was doing something specific with the puddles on the warehouse loading dock, turning them into temporary mirrors that held the sky. He thought about what came next. The board of directors, the investors, the Apex Tower project, the timeline, the financing contingencies. He thought about it the way a man thinks about a structural problem, not with feeling exactly, but with the part of the mind that is responsible for integrity assessment, that evaluates whether a load-bearing element has been compromised and what must be done to address it. He had built his career, and Leo's future, and his entire understanding of his own value, on a foundation that had just revealed itself to be rotten in ways he had not been willing to examine. That was the problem. It was, possibly, also the beginning of the solution. He started the car and drove back toward Manhattan. The Sterling Apex board met on the 3rd Tuesday of each month in the company's 42nd floor conference room, the one with the long glass table and the view of Midtown that Dante had specifically designed to be visible from every seat, as a reminder of the scale of what they were all part of. He had used that view deliberately for years, as a rhetorical tool, positioning himself against the backdrop of the city as a way of speaking with the authority of someone who had demonstrated his right to occupy that particular altitude. This meeting had been called at his request, on a Wednesday, outside the normal cycle. 12 board members filed in and took their seats. Dante stood at the head of the table without sitting, which was unusual. He had his hands in his pockets, which was also unusual. His CFO, seated to his right, had the particular expression of a man who had been given no advance information, and was now performing the internal calculations of someone trying to determine whether to be prepared for good news or bad. Dante spoke for 11 minutes. He presented the redesign. The Apex Tower project would precede the financing, the timeline, the 47 floors of mixed-use development. All of it would move forward. But the ground-level component was being restructured. The Fulton Street parcel was being withdrawn from the acquisition process. The diner would not be demolished. Instead, the architectural plan was being revised to incorporate the existing structure, its facade and interior preserved, enclosed within a purpose-built glass atrium that would connect the tower's lobby to a ground-level public marketplace. Moretti's diner at its center, protected, permanent. The original neon sign visible through 40 feet of structural glass. He had the revised renderings on the screen behind him. He let the board look at them. This changes your ground-level revenue projections, the CFO said, carefully. Yes, Dante said. By approximately how much? 11% downward on the ground floor retail income. Offset partially by the community designation, which qualifies us for the city's mixed-use cultural preservation tax incentive. He had done this math. He had been doing this math for 3 days. Net reduction of roughly 4% on the overall project return. The board was quiet. One member, a woman named Patricia Howe, who had been on the board since the company's second year and whose support Dante had always considered structurally important, leaned forward slightly. What's the reason for the change, Dante? He looked at her. He considered his answer for a moment longer than he usually allowed himself. I made a mistake, he said. I want to correct it. Patricia looked at him. The rest of the table looked at him. The city beyond the glass held its enormous, indifferent position. The tax incentive, his CFO said again, slowly, as though testing whether the math could carry the weight of what was being proposed. The tax incentive helps, Dante said. It doesn't justify it by itself. What justifies it is that it's the right thing to do, and I'm asking the board to approve it on that basis. The vote was 8-4 in favor. Dante arrived at Rosa's diner the following Saturday at 8 in the morning. With a contractor and a marble specialist and a document that had been prepared by his real estate attorney over the previous 4 days. The marble counter had been reinstalled the previous week. The Carrara match was close enough that, once polished and fitted, the seam between the new and original sections was visible only if you knew to look for it. Rosa had run her hand along its surface on the morning of the installation and said nothing, which Dante had learned to understand as a form of acknowledgement. The document was a permanent land trust, established in perpetuity, designating the Fulton Street property as a protected community commercial site, with restrictions on sale or redevelopment that bound not only Sterling Apex but any subsequent owner in the chain of title. The diner could not be demolished. It could not be converted to non-commercial use. It could not be absorbed into any adjacent development without the consent of a 3-member community review board, the membership of which included, as a permanent position, the current operator of Moretti's diner. Rosa sat at the repaired counter and read it carefully. She read it the way she read all important documents, slowly, without rushing toward the conclusion. Checking each paragraph against her understanding of the one before it. She turned to the last page. She looked at Dante's signature on the line designated for the grantor. Your attorneys let you do this? She asked. 4 of them told me I was making a significant financial error, Dante said. I thanked them and did it anyway. Rosa looked at the document for another moment. From the kitchen came the smell of the coffee she had started when they arrived, and outside on Fulton Street the Saturday morning foot traffic was beginning to build. Families, dog walkers. The particular democratic mix of a Brooklyn block that had so far managed to hold its own against the currents pulling it apart. Today, Rosa said, with a specificity that seemed to refer to something other than the document, the paperwork protected me instead of erasing me. She picked up the pen. She signed. The arrests were made on a Friday, 3 weeks later. The zoning board irregularities had been there for years. A pattern of expedited approvals and suppressed objections that a forensic accounting firm, retained at Dante's direction, and at his personal expense, was able to document with the kind of thoroughness that a subsequent federal investigation would describe, in its formal findings, as comprehensive and damning. 3 members of the board were charged. Marcus's former contact in the hospital's administrative system was identified in the course of the same investigation. Dante had provided his attorneys with everything he knew about the record access, and the attorneys had provided it to the relevant authorities, and Dante had accepted, without negotiation, that this disclosure would complicate his own position in the proceeding. His attorney had called it courageous. Dante had called it the least he could do, and had meant it literally. On the day the arrests were reported in the local paper, Rosa brought a slice of apple pie to the counter, set it in front of the newspaper, and poured herself a cup of coffee. She sat at the repaired marble counter and read the article from beginning to end in the morning light. Coming through the windows of the diner she still owned, in the building that now could not be taken from her, and the particular quality of the silence around her, was the kind that belongs to a person who has outlasted something that intended to outlast them. She ate the pie. It was excellent. It always was. The grand opening of Moretti's Plaza fell on the first Saturday of April, which gave Brooklyn a morning of the particular early spring light the borough does better than anywhere, pale and generous and arriving at a low angle that makes even utilitarian surfaces briefly beautiful. By 8 o'clock the Fulton Street block was already filling up, the sidewalk crowded in the way that only neighborhoods which have been through something and come out the other side can produce, people who feel a proprietary stake in the occasion, who came not just to see but to bear witness. The glass atrium caught the light and threw it in long refractions across the plaza. The new tower rose behind it, 47 floors of steel and glass still in the finishing phases of its upper stories. Cranes visible above the 35th floor, but at street level, framed by the atrium's structural glass and surrounded by the new plazas. Open-air seating and planters and the community board's mosaic installation on the east wall. Moretti's diner looked exactly as it always had: the hand-painted sign, the orange and yellow string lights in the window, the door with its push bar worn to a silver shine, and the neon sign, reinstated in the original pink and white, legible from a block away. Rosa had been inside since 5:30. She moved through the kitchen with the compressed efficiency of long practice, directing the 2 new part-time staff she had taken on for the opening, a woman named Delphine, who had cooked at a diner in Flatbush for 15 years and understood without being told how a kitchen of this size needed to work, and a young man named Ruben, who was working his way through a culinary program and moved with the watchful energy of someone filing everything away for later use. Leo Sterling came through the back door at 7:30. He was wearing a Moretti's apron that was 3 sizes too large and had to be rolled at the waist to stay on. And he carried himself with the combination of practiced casualness and suppressed excitement that belongs specifically to 12-year-old boys, attempting to appear as though they are not thrilled about something. He had been coming to the diner for 4 Saturdays in preparation for this day, learning, under Rosa's patient instruction, how to take an order correctly and how to carry 2 plates without tipping them and how to refill a coffee cup from the right side without leaning across the customer. "You're late," Rosa said, without looking up from the prep counter. "By 4 minutes, Leo said. "In a diner, 4 minutes is late." She turned and looked at him. She handed him a towel. "Wipe down the front counter. Start from the left." Leo went to the front with his towel, and Rosa watched him for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory. Dante arrived at 10. He came in through the front with the first public rush of the morning, moving with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to be unremarkable. A man in a flannel shirt and jeans, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the kiosk down the block because the diner's line was already out the door. He stood in the entrance for a moment and looked at the room. It was full in the way that specific rooms get full when the people in them actually want to be there. The corner booth held the Papademetrio family, 3 generations of them, and father. Tim was at the counter with a copy of the newspaper folded to the local section. Delphine was moving between the kitchen and the floor with the efficient grace of someone in full command of her element, and Ruben was concentrating very hard on a coffee refill, his tongue slightly visible between his teeth with the effort of it. And Leo was at the counter, taking an order from an elderly woman who was dictating her requirements with great specificity. And Leo was writing it down with a seriousness that suggested he understood the importance of getting it right. Dante stood near the door and watched his son take an order in the diner that belonged to the woman who had given that son his life, and something in his chest shifted in a way that had no financial equivalent and required no action. He found a stool at the far end of the counter. He ordered a burger. Rosa brought it herself, which was unusual given the volume of the morning's service. And she set it in front of him with the precise economy of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and why. $5, she said. She refilled his coffee without being asked. Dante ate. It was ground beef on a brioche bun with caramelized onions and a single slice of good cheddar and whatever Rosa put in the special sauce that no one had ever successfully reverse-engineered. And it had cost $5 in this diner for 23 years and showed no sign of changing. It was the best thing he had eaten in years, possibly, he thought, in his adult life. Though he understood that this assessment had less to do with the food than with the conditions under which he was eating it. When he was done, he paid, and tipped extravagantly. And Rosa gave him a look that suggested she was not impressed by the tip and he should not expect special treatment. He waited until the morning rush had thinned. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a key on the counter. Not a car key, a building key, old-fashioned, brass, the kind issued by a property management system that used physical locks. A second key followed it. "The trust documentation is on file," he said. "But these are the master keys to the plaza. The building manager will take direction from you on anything affecting the ground level and the atrium." Rosa looked at the keys. "I don't want to manage a plaza," she said. "You don't have to manage it," Dante said. "You just have to be here. Everything else arranges itself around that." Rosa considered this. She picked up one of the keys and looked at it for a moment, turning it in her fingers. Then she set it back down beside the other one. "At 45, Dante said, not to her exactly, more to the air of the room and everything in it, "I finally learned that starting over isn't failure." He paused. "I'm still working on understanding what it is." Rosa looked at him with the direct, unhurried attention of a woman who has been reading people across a counter for 30 years. And is rarely surprised by what she finds. "It's freedom," she said. "The starting over. Simply, as though stating something well established. You just have to get out of the way of it." She picked up the coffee pot and moved down the counter to refill Father Tim's cup. Dante left the diner at noon. He walked out onto the plaza and stood for a moment in the April light, hands in his pockets. Looking at the atrium and the tower behind it and the sign above the diner door, Moretti's, in its original pink neon, lit even in the daylight. Holding its own against the 47-story glass structure that now rose behind it like a companion rather than a replacement. He had left the keys on the counter. He stood there a little while longer, letting the plaza fill up around him, people finding tables, a group of kids running the length of the mosaic wall, the sound of the diner through its propped open door, mixing with the street sounds of a Brooklyn Saturday in April. And then he put his hands in his pockets and walked north along Fulton Street toward the subway. One man among the morning's ordinary traffic, nothing remarkable about him from the outside. Inside the diner, the neon sign of Moretti's hummed its steady current, and the glass of the Apex Tower caught its reflection and held it pink and white and quietly permanent, 47 floors of it, all the way up. "Friends, how did you find today's story? I've been sitting with it since the beginning, and I have to say, the living legacy is one that doesn't let go easily. We came in watching a man use every tool available to him to take something from a woman who had already given more than anyone had a right to ask. And we stayed to watch that same man discover, in the worst possible way, who he actually was. What stays with me is Rosa. Not the ending, though the ending is everything she deserved, but the middle. The part where she swept up the glass at midnight and didn't call the police. The part where she watched her husband's jukebox get destroyed and said, 'You're just digging a grave,' without raising her voice. Rosa never performed her dignity. She just had it. That's not a story thing, that's a life thing. Some people have been through enough that nothing left can shake the ground they're standing on. And Dante, I think about the moment in that darkened office with Rosa's photograph in his hands. He had everything. He had the money, the timeline, the legal instruments. He had won. And it meant nothing. Because the one person he had been fighting to protect, his son, his whole reason for any of it, was alive because of the woman he had been trying to destroy. That's not irony. That's instruction. There's a lesson in this story about what we build and why we build it. About the difference between a legacy and a monument. Dante spent years trying to put his name on the skyline. What he finally put his name on was a trust document that protected someone else's right to stay. That's the building that matters. We all face moments where we find out who we are when it costs us something. And we all have the chance, if we're paying attention, to course correct. It's never too late to be the person the story needed you to be from the start. I hope today's story brought you something real, maybe a moment of recognition, or a little courage. Or just the good feeling of watching justice find its way home. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, and hit that like button, and it would mean the world to me if you'd share this with someone who needs to hear a story about starting over. Good things come to those who stay.